My name is Claire Morgan. I am 39 years old, and for almost 2 decades I have worked as a commercial architect. Buildings have always made sense to me. A foundation either carries the weight or it doesn't. A beam is either strong enough or it fails. Concrete never lies because it doesn't know how. People are different. Families are different. For most of my life, I believed that if I kept solving everyone's problems, eventually someone would notice I was carrying the entire roof. I was wrong. The day my parents sold my beach house without my permission, I finally understood something no blueprint had ever taught me. Sometimes the strongest wall in a family isn't there to protect the house. It's there because everyone else keeps leaning on it. 3 days after my parents sold my house, a stranger called them during dinner. He spoke for less than 2 minutes. By the time he hung up, my father had stopped eating. My mother kept asking the same question. "What do you mean? Impossible." The stranger answered only once. "Because the woman whose signature is on those papers hasn't legally owned that property for almost 7 years. Silence. Then another sentence. "I suggest you both stop speaking until your attorney arrives." That phone call eventually became Exhibit 4 in a criminal investigation. But none of us knew that yet. At that moment, I was sitting almost 9,000 miles away in Tokyo, watching rain slide down the windows of my hotel room, holding an email that ended with one sentence. "You weren't using the beach house anyway." I didn't cry. I didn't call my mother. I didn't argue. I opened my laptop. Because architects don't panic. We inspect the damage first. And what I found during the next 72 hours changed my family forever. Welcome back to Reality Drama Story, where family secrets unfold and quiet decisions change everything. If you are new here, drop a comment and subscribe. Now let's get into it. The beach house wasn't expensive when my grandmother bought the land. In 1987, nobody wanted that stretch of coastline outside Cape Elizabeth, Maine. The winters were harsh. The road flooded every spring. Tourists preferred larger towns farther south. My grandmother preferred quiet. She bought 3 acres overlooking the Atlantic for $82,000. Everyone told her she was wasting money. She smiled and planted blueberry bushes anyway. When I was 8 years old, she would take me there every summer. We didn't have a house then, only an old camper. She used to spread blueprints across the picnic table while I colored beside her. Grandma Evelyn wasn't an architect. She was a carpenter. Back then, women in construction were rare. She taught me how to read measurements before multiplication tables. Buildings, she used to say, don't collapse because of one bad board. They collapse because nobody fixes the first crack. I remembered that sentence years later. Too late. When she passed away in 2014, her will surprised everyone. The land came to me. Not shared. Not divided. Only me. She wrote one handwritten paragraph. "Claire understands how to build things that last." My parents smiled during the reading. My younger brother, Eric, smiled too. At least I thought he did. Looking back now, maybe he was simply calculating. I met my husband, Daniel, 1 year later. He was a civil engineer. The first thing we ever argued about was staircase dimensions. The second was roofing materials. I married him anyway. Together we spent nearly 5 years building our beach house. Every vacation, every long weekend, every holiday. Instead of traveling abroad, we poured concrete. Instead of buying luxury furniture, we installed insulation. Friends called us obsessed. Maybe we were, but every wall had a story. The oak staircase came from reclaimed timber Daniel found at an old shipyard. The kitchen island was built from wood salvaged after a coastal storm. My grandmother's rocking chair faced the ocean exactly where she always wanted it. Nothing inside that house was accidental. Everything had history, including the people who visited. Every July, my parents stayed for 2 weeks. My mother filled the kitchen with homemade pies. Dad fished every morning. Eric usually appeared sometime after lunch carrying expensive sunglasses and stories about businesses that never seemed to exist 6 months later. He always needed money. There was always another investment, another opportunity, another emergency. At first, it sounded temporary. Then it became permanent. My parents never said no. Instead, they quietly paid credit cards, car loans, business debts, rent, legal fees. It became so normal that nobody even discussed it. They simply called it helping family. Whenever I questioned it, my mother always answered the same way. Your brother just needs one more chance. Funny thing about one more chance. It eventually becomes 23. I know. I counted. By 2024, Daniel and I had almost finished paying off the construction loan. The property had increased in value dramatically. What had once been worth less than $200,000 was now appraised at just over $1.86 million. We never talked about selling. Not once. That house wasn't an investment. It was proof. Proof that patience becomes something solid. Then came Tokyo. Our architectural firm won a 14-month redevelopment contract for a waterfront transportation hub. The biggest project of my career. I almost declined. Daniel convinced me. You've earned this. He stayed behind to supervise projects in Boston while I relocated overseas for several months at a time. Everything felt stable. Until October 17th. Tokyo. 4:52 a.m. My phone vibrated. One email. From Mom. Subject. Good news about Eric. I smiled. For exactly 3 seconds. Then I opened it. The message contained only 5 short paragraphs. Claire, your father and I finally solved Eric's financial problems. We sold the beach house. The buyers were very understanding. Everything has already been signed. Eric can finally start over. You weren't using the house anyway. Love. Mom. I read it once. Then again. The words didn't become more reasonable. They became stranger. Sold. Already signed. Buyers. My beach house. Not our. Mine. I checked the timestamp. 3:31 in the afternoon back home. Offices were still open. Lawyers were still working. Banks were still processing documents. If what she wrote was true, someone somewhere believed they owned my house. I never answered the email. Instead, I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. You sound awake. I just got an email. What happened? My parents sold the beach house. Silence. Not confused silence. Measured silence. The kind engineers used before speaking. Then Daniel asked exactly one question. Do you want me to drive there? Please. I'll call you from the driveway. 47 minutes later, my phone rang again. His breathing was different. Claire. What? There are moving trucks. I closed my eyes. Furniture? They're loading everything. My God. There's also a locksmith. Another pause. I think they're changing every lock. I heard footsteps. Voices. Then Daniel lowered his voice. They're carrying your grandmother's rocking chair. That sentence hurt more than anything else. Not because of the chair. Because somebody had touched it. Without asking. Daniel walked toward the crew. I listened through the phone. The foreman sounded polite. Professional. We've got paperwork. Daniel replied calmly. I own this property with my wife. The foreman hesitated, then said something that would echo through the entire investigation. I'm just following the documents. Documents. Plural. Which meant this wasn't some misunderstanding. Somebody had prepared paperwork. Legal paperwork. Professional paperwork. Daniel called the local police. While he waited, I sat alone inside a hotel room overlooking Tokyo Bay. Outside, construction cranes moved across the skyline. Inside, my entire childhood was being loaded into trucks. I opened my laptop. created a new folder. Its name was simple: Beach House. Inside it, I added everything: property deed, insurance policy, construction permits, tax records, photographs, closing documents, mortgage releases. Then I remembered something from nearly 6 years earlier. A conversation almost nobody else remembered. After Eric's third failed business, my attorney had suggested something unusual. She said wealthy properties owned by individuals often became easy targets during family disputes, especially when relatives assumed inheritance worked differently than the law. Back then, Daniel and I followed her advice. Quietly, without telling anyone. The paperwork took less than 2 weeks. After that, the beach house technically belonged to someone else, not another person. Something much more interesting. And absolutely nobody in my family knew. That discovery was about to turn their perfect sale into something legally impossible. The attorney who helped Daniel and me 6 years earlier never called it a trick. She called it a precaution. In March of 2019, we transferred the beach house into Harborview Holdings, LLC. Daniel and I were the only two members of the company. The operating agreement was straightforward and very specific. Any sale, refinance, transfer, or mortgage required both member signatures. Not one, two, in person. Original ink. No exceptions. We never mentioned the change to my parents because there was no reason to. They still used the house every summer. Nothing changed for them, except the paperwork. And paperwork has a way of waiting quietly until someone assumes it doesn't matter. The next morning in Tokyo, I sent every document to a real estate attorney in Maine. An hour later, she called. "Claire," she said, "if these are the only documents they signed, the buyers don't own your house." I asked the question I already knew the answer to. "Then what did my parents sell?" She paused. A promise they had no legal authority to make. That sentence stayed with me. Architects understand the difference between a drawing and a building. One is an idea. The other can actually stand. My parents had sold an idea. Daniel spent the next 2 days documenting everything. Every missing piece of furniture. Every damaged wall. Every item removed. The police photographed the empty rooms. My grandmother's rocking chair was gone. The dining table Daniel built by hand was gone. Even the brass telescope my grandfather left me had disappeared. Nothing was broken. Everything had been carefully packed. That somehow made it worse. Strangers had wrapped my memories in moving blankets and labeled them with shipping stickers. 3 days after my mother's email, the title company completed its routine ownership search. At 11:18 a.m., the file stopped moving. The closing officer noticed the deed belonged to Harborview Holdings, LLC, not to Claire Morgan. The power of attorney attached to the sale authorized my father to represent me personally. It had absolutely no authority over the LLC. The closing officer called the real estate broker. The broker called the buyers. Then, at exactly 12:41 p.m., he called my parents. I wasn't there. Later, I obtained the phone transcript through Discovery. The broker asked only one question: "Who told you that you had the legal right to sell this property?" My mother answered confidently, "Our daughter." The broker replied quietly, "According to county records, your daughter hasn't personally owned that property since 2019. Then came another silence. Finally, he said, "I'm terminating the transaction immediately." The buyers wanted answers. So did the broker. So did the police. Within 24 hours, everyone was asking the same question: where had the signature come from? Because it wasn't mine. I flew home 4 days later. Daniel met me at the airport. Neither of us talked much during the drive. He simply handed me a folder. Inside were photographs. The empty living room. The missing furniture. The damaged porch railing. The drilled front door lock. Then one final picture. My grandmother's flower garden. Someone had driven a moving truck directly across it. I stared at the photo for a long time. Flowers grow back. Trust doesn't. 2 days later, my mother invited everyone to Sunday dinner. She sounded unusually cheerful. "We'll explain everything." Family dinners had always followed the same pattern: roast chicken, homemade bread, my father's quiet voice, my mother's louder one, Eric arriving late. That evening, nothing was different. Until I counted. My name was spoken 14 times before I said a single word. Every sentence sounded almost rehearsed. Claire will understand. Claire always helps. Claire knows family comes first. I listened. I watched. I let them finish. Even Eric avoided looking at me. Halfway through dessert, my mother folded her hands. "We know you're upset." I nodded. She smiled, relieved that I wasn't arguing. Then she continued. "The buyers are willing to wait. We simply need you to sign a few updated documents." She slid a folder across the table. I didn't touch it. Instead, I asked one question. "When exactly did I authorize Dad to sell my house?" The room became still. Dad looked down. Eric suddenly became fascinated with his coffee cup. Mom answered first. "You gave permission years ago." "I did. You signed paperwork. I'd love to see it." Dad slowly removed a folded document. Even before I opened it, I knew. It wasn't my signature. It was a copy of one, lifted from an old construction permit, poorly resized, placed onto a completely different document. The dates didn't even match the permit number. Someone had worked very hard, not carefully. I placed the paper back on the table. Then I looked at my father. "Dad." He finally met my eyes. "Did you sign this?" He didn't answer. My mother answered for him. "We did what we had to do." Still calm, I asked another question. "Did either of you know the beach house belongs to Harborview Holdings?" Neither of them reacted. That told me everything. "What company?" My mother frowned. "Exactly. What company?" I reached into my briefcase and placed 3 documents on the dining table. The deed, the LLC operating agreement, the state registration. One by one. No speeches. No accusations. Just paper. My father's hands started shaking. He read the first page, then the second, then removed his glasses and read them again. Finally, he whispered, "This says, yes, you don't own it? I own half. And Daniel? The other half." He looked at my mother. She stared at the pages as though they were written in another language. Eric finally spoke. "So, what happens now?" Before I could answer, my Aunt Helen, who had been silent all evening, set down her fork. She had spent 30 years as a probate clerk. She understood documents better than emotions. She looked directly at my parents. "You forged a signature." Nobody corrected her. She continued. "You attempted to sell property you didn't own." Silence. "You involved innocent buyers." Another silence. Then she looked at me. "Claire, whatever you decide, make sure it's the decision you'll still respect 10 years from now." It was the wisest sentence spoken that evening. The investigation moved faster than I expected. The buyers recovered their deposit through insurance. The broker surrendered every document voluntarily. A handwriting examiner confirmed the signature had been copied from an older public record. The district attorney filed charges, not because I wanted revenge, because the evidence existed. Some structures fail under their own weight. This was one of them. Months later, the case ended with a negotiated plea agreement. Both of my parents received probation. They were ordered to pay $74,860 in restitution for damages, legal expenses, locksmith services, and property recovery. Eric entered a financial counseling program after admitting that more than $310,000 in debt had triggered the entire disaster. Daniel eventually found my grandmother's rocking chair at a second-hand furniture warehouse almost 60 miles away. The original price tag was still attached. $140. Some things are priceless only to the people who remember them. We bought it back. The first evening after everything was finally over, Daniel and I carried the chair onto the porch ourselves. The Atlantic looked exactly the way it had when my grandmother first brought me there. The ocean hadn't taken sides. It never does. Daniel placed the chair where it had always belonged. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Sometimes silence repairs things words cannot. A few weeks later, I received a handwritten letter from my father. Only 3 sentences. I confused helping one child with sacrificing another. I finally understand the difference. I'm sorry. I folded the letter and placed it inside my grandmother's old toolbox. Not because forgiveness erases history. Because history deserves to be remembered honestly. People sometimes ask whether I ever trusted my family again. Trust doesn't return all at once. It returns the way a house is rebuilt after a storm. One beam, one wall, one inspection at a time. Some rooms are never exactly the same. That doesn't mean the entire house is lost. This wasn't revenge. It was a boundary written in the language of the law. Because love without boundaries eventually becomes permission. If this story reminded you to know your worth, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, drop a comment, and I will see you in the next one.